Dave's been a bishop since 2010, I believe. I can't tell you how many years he has served Navajo land. And just some of you may know this. I know some of you know this, others don't. Dave went to seminary at the same time with Clifton Mann, and they were like best friends. And he's very close with Joe Craig now as well. And this is one of the most respected bishops you will ever meet. He is just the best guy. Anyway, I'm looking forward to his presentation, and I'm going to let you come on up here, and I'm going to get out of the way.
Before I get started, I want to recognize the hospitality that you all have exhibited to me on behalf of the Diocese of Northwest Texas. From my wonderful visit with Edson, who met me at the airport and has chauffeured me around and taken great care of me, and the opportunity that I've had to spend some time with you all a little bit yesterday, and then again this morning. You are to be admired and appreciated for the hospitality that you show to a stranger. So thank you for that. I was going to tell you the Cliff Mann stories. No, I'm kidding about that. Because some of those I can't tell. So, but as Bishop Scott did indicate, Cliff was my best friend in my time in my life in the seminary. And sadness for me was that our journeys took us to different places, and he continued to be in Texas, and I went back to Arizona, and so the only time that we really had to be in relationship was by phone, and occasionally we would get a chance to get together. But he was so supportive of me and my ministry and my journey, and to get to know Joe was just an extreme pleasure, and I'm blessed to know her and now to know Cliff. So I feel a connection to you all in being here. Couple of things. I brought a book just for your own information. I'm going to throw it in the diocesan library. 1491. I don't know whether you all have had a chance to read this or not. The title is significant because it's not 1492, 1491, but it's a new Revelations of America before Columbus. And it truly gives a sense of the relationship the indigenous community had with one another, trades that were going on and other things prior to the time of Columbus. So I'm going to leave that with you all to be able to get from the diocesan office or whatever. Also, I'd ask Elizabeth to offer to you, and I don't know where, Elizabeth, where did we put these? Okay. This is the newsletter. This happens to be the spring newsletter from Navajo Land, and I brought probably about 75 or 80 copies that are in the back that if you'd like to pick up, it'll give you a little bit of information about that. I could stand up here and talk to you about Navajo Land literally for the next 8 hours. And so I'm going to try to hold my conversation to some specific points. I'm going to visit with you a little bit about the history of the Episcopal Church in Navajo Land. I'm going to talk a little bit about Navajo Land prior to it becoming the Navajo Land Area Mission and what took place with that. I'll speak a little bit about that journey up until the time of my election of bishop, and then I'll talk with you about the things that have taken place in the 12 years that I've been honored and fortunate enough to serve as bishop in the Episcopal Church in Navajo Land. Did you all know that I flunked retirement? Okay. I retired in 2008, and I went back to Arizona, and I had served as canon of the ordinary in Utah, and it was a wonderful journey, and it was one of the best jobs I've had in the life of the church. And I told my bishop, it's time for me to go, and I'm going to go on back. And so I did. I went back home to Arizona and retired, and that lasted 2 weeks. And my bishop called me, and she said, David, I'm going to retire in a year and a half, and I'm not going to hire another canon of the ordinary. So would you come back up here for another year or so and do what you were doing? I said, oh, sure. So I went back up to Utah, and I served until December, because she was going to retire in May. And so I served until December and retired again in the end of 2009. The House of Bishops was meeting in Salt Lake in that October, and the presiding bishop, through her canon of the ordinary, called me up and said, I would like to visit with you about Navajo land. I had no idea what she wanted to visit about, but I've been involved with Navajo land off and on since 1988. And so I went down and I visited with her, and the next thing I knew was she was saying, would you consider going and being bishop in Navajo land? So I said, well, yeah, we'll see about that. Now, you must know that in 2009, I was 69 years of age. Okay? Now, you see what's going to happen, right? Okay, you see the problem coming, right? Okay. And so anyhow, we went through all that process, and I was elected. I'm the only bishop in Navajo land's history that has been elected by the Navajo. Every other bishop has been appointed by the House of Bishops. And so it was really exciting to be honored and to appreciated by the Navajo and to be elected. And I was elected in October of 2009 and then ratified by the House of Bishops in March of 2010 and then consecrated on August 7th in 2010. And I said to my wife, I said, honey, in your wildest dreams, could you believe that I would be Bishop of Navajo land? And she said, honey, you're not in my wildest dreams. I'm smart enough not to pursue that. Okay. So, as I said, I've had the joy of being able to serve them. And as happens, and I'm sure that you've had this experience too, that what we see from the outside and what we think we know from the outside is not necessarily what we find when we get on the inside. And that was certainly true for Navajo land, because I was not aware, even though I'd been involved with Navajo land, both when I was in Arizona and both when I was in Utah, with Navajo land, I had no idea of the difficulties that Navajo land was experiencing. Give you some factual things that I have that I think might be important for you, and if you remember, I'm going to try to journey this along. Navajo land is one of 574 federally recognized tribes. 229 of those are in Alaska. Navajo land itself has registered roughly about 400,000 Navajo people. Those that live on the reservation vary from 160 to 185,000, depending on employment and other factors that go along with that. Navajo land is 27,000 square miles, about the size of West Virginia, and is the largest geographical reservation that we have in the United States. Navajo land, they are anticipating that by 2050, there will only probably be 2 tribes that will continue to use their language and know their language, and that's going to be the Cherokee and the Navajo. And so there's a real need to continue to try to work on capturing the languages of other tribes. The Episcopal Church has been involved with Navajo land since roughly the 1890s. The history of Navajo land, and we heard Bishop Scott talk a little bit about the boarding schools in Canada and the Archbishop. Boarding schools began to do their work in the late 19th century and carrying over into the 20th century, and that didn't stop until 1972 here in the United States. But in 1830 was the Indian Relocation Act that was put in place by President Jackson. And that's really what led to the Trail of Tears and a number of things that I'm sure you remember through history. In the moving of indigenous people off of their land, primarily for the benefit of those who were trying to grow cotton and other things. That was part of the move there. How that impacted the Navajo was by the expansion of commerce and other things by Europeans and others, by the United States, finally impacted the West by roughly around 1860. And the two major tribes at that time that were causing problems for the United States were the Apache and the Navajo. And primarily because they felt that they were being invaded and were fighting back over that invasion. By 1863, 1864, the Navajo experienced what is called the Long Walk. And the Long Walk was similar to the Trail of Tears, where Kit Carson and a band of Ute agents went into Canyon de Chelly and did a scorched earth policy, and that was the final act on driving the Navajo out of their homeland, and marched them to Bosque Redondo, which was over at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, roughly 400 plus miles on a forced march. There were over 53 forced marches from 1863 to about 1866. Most of the indigenous populations that were moved off of their land never had an opportunity to return. That was not so for the Navajo, because the Navajo were able to convince the government to let them return home. And so they were able to go back within the four sacred mountains. The land not as large it was when they left, but again, being able to go back into the four sacred mountains, which was extremely important to their spirituality and understanding of culture and tradition. The thing that we don't think about when we think about reservations is that we think about reservations as having sovereign rights and it's sort of a nation and things like that. A reservation is another form of incarceration, because that was the intent. And the intent was to take a people that were different than us and place them in an isolated situation and then control them in any way that you can control them, so they're no longer a problem. That was the intent in terms of providing, if you will, reservations. And so that was what took place for the Navajo. But they were able to go back to their own place. They were able to go and build and do some things there. By the 1890s, the bishop of what would have been then New Mexico, because Arizona was not a state, so New Mexico was also part of Arizona, became aware that there was not health care being provided for Navajo people over at Fort Defiance, New Mexico, because it was not Arizona, it was Arizona territory. And he made a trip out from Albuquerque and investigated that, and out of his visit at Good Shepherd Mission, he formed formally Good Shepherd Mission Hospital for the Navajo. And that's how the relationship really began with the Episcopal Church. And it really happened because of some lay women from New York, Upper New York, and from a lieutenant in the cavalry who was an Episcopalian and let them know of what was going on back there. And so they began to build that. 1922, the focus then shifted to the Farmington area because the church at that time was really about health and wholeness. And how do we respond to the health and wholeness of Navajo? Because they weren't welcome in white people's hospitals and or healthcare. So in Farmington, in between 1919 and 1922, do you remember what was happening in 1919, 1922? But what else? The Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was taking place, and Navajo were not welcome into white people's hospital. So in 1922, the final cornerstone was laid for the hospital in Farmington for Navajo people, built by the Navajo with help from the Episcopal Church. In 1944 to 46, in Bluff, Utah, at St. Christopher's, Baxter Liebler, who was a priest out of Connecticut and had come to Navajo land and had embraced Navajo culture and understanding, built a clinic to help pregnant Navajo women to give birth and began to provide health care. So the Episcopal Church has had a history, if you will, of trying to provide health and wholeness to Navajo people. Navajo people have continued to, through the century, to experience the difficulties. Bishop Scott spoke to the boarding school incident, and we have documentation of white people coming in their pickup trucks and literally grabbing children, off the road, and taking them off to boarding school without the parents having any idea of what's going on. There's written documentation of that. But the boarding school was a problem because, again, it was trying to take away the culture and tradition. Okay. Following the boarding school incidents, what incidentally went on to 1972, because the boarding schools did not stop until the federal government brought a stop to it in 1972. And so I can remember as a child growing up in Phoenix, my mother was an educator, and I was probably about 9 or 10, and my mother and I were going somewhere downtown, and here is this chain link fence down on 7th Avenue and Indian School Road, where there are children hanging on the fence looking out, and I'm on the outside looking in. And I said to my mother, "What did those children do wrong?" And she said, "Well, they didn't do anything wrong. They're just Indian children at school." And I can still visualize that and see that in my mind, and I'm thinking, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But that's the situation that existed at that particular time. In between 1944 and 1946, the federal government put in place what they called the Livestock Reclamation Act, which basically dictated how many sheep, horses, cows Navajo people could have. And their rationale was that it was overgrazing on the reservation, and consequently it was causing runoff and was going to affect the building of Boulder Dam. And so you can begin to see the continuing impact that federal government has had over the years on a people, and the impact of that today is still existent because we're dealing with intergenerational trauma. The Navajo people never talked about that. The people that experienced the Bosque Redondo trip, the long walk, came back from that and never talked about that experience. Because culture did not allow them to talk about that. And so consequently, while they experienced that, and what we would know today as post-traumatic stress syndrome had affected them in a similar kind of way, which then impacted their families. And you see that pass on from generation to generation to generation. Okay? And so part of what the church has tried to do, the Episcopal Church has tried to do, and other mainline denominations, is to begin to respond in terms of health and wholeness. Navajo land is a matrilineal society, and so the role of the woman plays an extremely important role. And so what we're trying to do today is to find how we can provide health and wholeness to women and the families, because it'll impact the whole society. So we're continuing to work on that. Let me see what else I wanted to share with you real quick. Navajo land was in 3 dioceses to begin with when it began. And so it would have been in the Diocese of Utah, and the Diocese of Rio Grande, and the Diocese of Arizona. And that took place roughly from 1894 up until 1978. And there was not a lot of what I would call commingling or networking, if you will, because we're roughly looking at a transportation problem, and we're looking at between the 3 regions, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, roughly 2.5 hours by today's standards. And so you can begin to know what it would be back when you would have had a buckboard or horse or the transportation that we had back then. So there was no interaction necessarily between the 3 regions. In 1978, the House of Bishops felt that there was enough population in the 3 regions to look at what if we brought that together as a diocese, and we would have an indigenous diocese. Now, I've been around this church long enough to say that that was part of the reason. The other part of that reason was economic. They felt that if they could pull it together like that the cost that it was impacting on the 3 dioceses would be lessened, because now they could fund it out of General Convention and begin to have proper funding and not have that demand on the respective diocese. So in 1978, Navajo Area Mission was formed, one of 3 missions of the Episcopal Church. The other 2 are Guam and the churches in Europe. But we are a mission of the Episcopal Church. And so the Episcopal Church has responsibility for us in a lot of ways. And so we're funded out of the General Convention budget. And where's Mike? Mike is to be applauded again, because this past General Convention, Mike was extremely gracious, along with Bishop Fisher, in hearing the 4 aided dioceses come together, the 4 bishops, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Alaska, and present to them as a body concerns that we had for indigenous ministry and where they're going to go, and they graciously listened to us and have responded. So Mike, thanks so much for that. Trying to think where I want to go with this. So in 78, the House of Bishops formed us. In 79, General Convention ratified that at the 79 convention, and the Navajo Land Area Mission was formed. The bulk of the Navajo reservation is in Arizona, and so the decision was that Province 8 would be the province in which Navajo land would dwell. It would make more sense that we were over here with y'all, but that's not what they decided. And the funding, how many of you were around and know the term Coalition 14? Do any of you know that term? Oh, good. I'm glad to at least see somebody recognize that. Coalition 14 was the funding source that provided for the 14 missionary districts and Navajo land, because at that time, Arizona, Hawaii, Utah, none of those were full-fledged dioceses. They were really missionary districts in the process of forming. So they formed Coalition 14 with the intent of being a vehicle to fund those 14 dioceses in Navajo land. And so that's sort of how it was funded in terms of that particular time. And it continued on that way until probably around I'm guessing 2002, when Coalition 14 ceased to exist. And then funding went directly now to DFM, to what was PBNF, and then now is going to be General Convention. So we move ahead from 79. We have, in that period of time, we have 6 bishops from 78 until Stephen Plummer is elected. And Stephen Plummer was Navajo and was the first Navajo bishop. And he was elected and consecrated in 1990. So from 1978 to 1990, you have 6 what I would call absentee bishops. They had other jurisdictions, but then they would come in and do confirmations and that kind of stuff. Stephen served from 1990 to his death in 2006, of when he died of cancer. The funding that was available for Navajo land was limited. Stephen was to have a mentor to walk with him and to help him understand about becoming a bishop and being a bishop and how to do that. And his mentor was Bishop Wes Frensdorf, who at that time was the bishop of Nevada, and resigned from that position, took a part-time job with the Diocese of Arizona, helping out Bishop Joe Houston, and then a third time was to be in Navajo land and to help Stephen in his journey of being a bishop. That was a disaster to happen, because Wes Frensdorf, returning from a confirmation service in Page, Arizona, was killed in an airplane crash on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, which took away Stephen's mentor, if you will, and good friend. And so Stephen found himself in many ways alone in learning what it meant to be a bishop and having the support they needed, and it was a difficult period of time. And Stephen, by 1994, found himself in difficulty himself and was suspended for about a year. And that's where I really began to pick up my work, because the presiding bishop asked me if I would go to Navajo land about every 6 weeks and be Stephen's administrative mentor. And so that, between Coalition 14 and that's sort of how I began to get involved with Navajo land. Navajo land did not have very many priests. Most of the clergy in Navajo land that came were Anglos. We had no indigenous priests at that particular time. We had lay pastors that were Navajo in really the 3 regions, and they sort of made sure that they sort of served like a deacon, but they were a lay pastor, and so they would make sure things were set up for meetings and things that were set up for services and things like that, and did a wonderful job. But they were paid a pittance, and at that time they didn't have any pension, so it was just whatever they had. And so then Stephen was elected. Stephen went from, like I said, from 1990 to 2006. At that time there were there were 3 Navajo clergy, counting Stephen, a couple of Anglo clergy that were trying to help out, but it was very limited in terms of clergy, particularly in terms of Navajo clergy. When I took over, I was elected, I took over in 2010. I had 1 Navajo priest, and I had 1 Anglo priest. We used to have churches across the entire reservation, and if you've ever been out there, when I talk about that, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we had congregations that went from Farmington clear over to Tuba City, which is the Highway 89 over by Flagstaff and that area. It goes up to Page. We had congregations just outside of Page at Navajo Mountain, and we had congregations literally all over the reservation. Small. When I talk about a congregation, y'all, if we had this many people, it'd be wonderful, okay? So I'm talking, we're talking about a congregation, you'd have maybe 25, 30 people, because they were primarily clan gatherings that were there. By the time I became bishop, we were down to 6 congregations that were functioning, with 2 clergy and myself, and I had 2 lay pastors left. Okay? And so what I was asked to do was to come in and to raise up Navajo leadership, both clergy and lay, and then to begin the restructure and the rebuilding of the Episcopal Church in Navajo Land. Now, I want you to hear this in that I'm being asked by the presiding bishop to consider this in October of 2008, thinking I know what I'm getting into. Okay? And now it's August of 2010. The date is August 8th. I was ordained August 7th. And now I know what I'm into. Okay? And so we began literally to rebuild the church. How many of you know Cornelia Eaton? Okay, you know Cornelia. Cornelia is my can of the ordinary, and Cornelia is literally my right hand. And her mother, Alice Mason, was a lay pastor, and I'll tell you a story about that in just a minute about her mother. But between the two of them, they literally have helped me move forward in terms of what I'm doing and in terms of the building of the church. And it's been a joy. It's been a challenge. I had to let my one Navajo priest go and start over. And the reason I was going to tell you the story about Cornelia's mom, one of the things that I did is that I formed a group of Navajo elders when I first became bishop, because I wanted to be sure as a Belagana, as an Anglo, as an outsider, that I was honoring culture and I was honoring tradition. And I really needed to hear from the elders that I was doing this right and that I wasn't making mistakes. And this one particular priest was having difficulty, and I kept trying to work with this person and help them to resolve some issues. And so I went to my elders and I said, this is what's going on. What should I do? And this is what I'm trying to do. And they supported what I was doing. And 6 months later, I went back to my elders and I said, this is not working. And so this is what I'm doing. And what do you think about that? And they encouraged me to go ahead and do that. So years gone by. And so I go to my elders and I said, this isn't working. What do you think I should do? And Cornelia's mom said, well, you probably just ought to fire her. And I said, well, I'm not ready to do that. Okay. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to try this. So another 6 months goes by and we try that, and that's not working. And so I go back 6 months. Now it's a year and a half, right? And so I go back to my elders, and they all listen to me, and they nod and all that stuff. And so, again, Alice Mason looks at me and says, Bishop, you just need to fire her. And I said, oh, okay. So, well, I'm going to try this, I said. So, okay. So I try that. So now it's 2 years, okay? Now, this is 2 years of dealing with the same problem, okay? And so I go back and I said, okay, this is what's going on, and I think I've run out of ways to go forward. What do you think I should do? And Alice looks at me and she says, Bishop, you're just too soft. Fire her. And so I ended up having to, I didn't have to fire her. because she was old enough and I was able to say, you know, this isn't working. And why don't, because now you're on pension, and why don't we find a way that you might resign so that you've got, and so we were able to resolve the problem in a healthy and positive way. But my elder counsel is pretty direct with me about how to go forward and make sure I'm doing stuff. How are we doing on time? We're okay? I can talk about Navajo land all day, and that's not fair to you all, and so I'd like to throw it open to Q&A, and if any of you had a question that you wondered about or asked about or wanted to know, it would give you an opportunity to do that. Edson?
Say something about the incorporation of Navajo culture into the Episcopal approach to Christianity?
Sure. On the reservation, there are three expressions of spirituality. And so you have the traditional Navajo culture in terms of they embrace Navajo spirituality and choose not necessarily to have anything to do with Christianity. And then you have that group of Christians that basically say you need to deny your Indianness, embrace Jesus Christ, and forget the fact that you're Navajo. And then you have the third group, which is really where the mainline denominations are, Episcopal and Lutheran and Presbyterian and Methodist and Roman Catholic, that embrace some form of Navajo spirituality in the midst of the work that we're doing. The Episcopal Church is probably the most progressive in that we embrace and support all Navajo culture and tradition. When I do ordinations, and I've been blessed to have 7 Navajo clergy ordained since I've been bishop, 4 with MDivs, and so I'm really excited about that, and I'm excited and appreciative of both CDSP, Church School of the Pacific, and Virginia Seminary for providing us with scholarships to make that happen. But where I was going with that is that we really try to embrace the medicine man. If I'm doing the ordination, we'll have the medicine man come and be a part of the ordination and the work that's going on there, recognizing the 4 sacred mountains and the 4 directions, and offering blessing way prayers for our ordinand. We have Navajo included in the service, so that the Lord's Prayer is done in Navajo land. The bishop does his blessing or her blessing, depending if we have a female bishop with us. But we also have the blessing way prayer at the end, so we have a Navajo blessing way prayer at the end. The gospel is done both in Navajo and in English, and so we really embrace that. When I have a Navajo person who's been raised on the fact that they have to give up their Navajo-ness, where they're not free to wear their jewelry, as an example, into church because that's not acceptable. They're not allowed to bring any of their traditional dress into the church because it's not acceptable. I remind them of our Bible and the fact that there is an Old Testament in our Bible and that there is a New Testament in our Bible. And the Old Testament speaks to the old ways and the old relationships and the understanding of that relationships for the Hebrew people, and that they're introduced to a new way through the life of Jesus the Christ and a new perspective and a new understanding. And remind them that prior to knowing Christ, that they have an Old Testament and that they live out of the traditions and cultures that they once embraced, and that the relationship that they have. So to deny where they were on their own journey is really to take away part of who they are, but to recognize that in the perspective of Jesus the Christ and what he now brings to the table in a new and different way for them. So it's freed up a number of them to be able to continue to move forward in terms of their own culture and their own traditions, their own language, at the same time continuing to worship and be a part of the Christian community. So thank you for that, Edson. So, yeah. Anybody else? Please, Justin.
So I think I've heard a lot of churches that go to reservations and do projects and things like that. Right? And I wonder if there's a different way of interacting in this relationship in which we might be on pilgrimage to a place like Navajo, where we are the learners and not the doers, right? And I wonder if there's opportunities that kind of been explored or kind of what's going on in Navajo land to invite the outsiders to come in and learn from that experience and grow in their relationship.
I'm smiling because I've not paid him to say this. Thank you for the question. What has happened in the past prior to my episcopate is what you're talking about, is that groups would come over and they would do. And those things, the things they did were important for us. But they would come over and do a project. The Navajo mayor may not interact with them, depending on when the time was. And then they would go, and a lot of it that you saw with youth groups would come and they would have an experience, or small group. And it was almost like checking a box. And I don't mean that disrespectfully at all. I mean, because we didn't know enough as to how to interact with that, and you all didn't know enough, and so we just did the best that we could do. One of the things that I brought to the table, and it is changing, is that I asked us, as we looked at that as Navajo land, that let's be clear about what we're asking people to come and do, and then we're asking them also at that same time to teach us how to do that, so that we're able then to be able to do it ourselves, build that relationship, and then continue that relationship with them coming and doing something else. And so we've begun that process when I first became a bishop. We now are moving to the pilgrimage idea, where we're really looking at a relationship and what that might be, and building the relationship first. Doesn't take away from the projects if folks want to do that. And with our infrastructure being what it was, and with deferred maintenance that we've had for 75 years, literally, we have a lot of work that can be done in terms of the physical plant. But we're really looking at how can we begin to share with those that come and be with us the history, the spirituality, the physical locale of what it means to be in Navajo land. I am in the process of, when I say I, this has been a mutual group, because it's not I, it's about what we've done together. But we're in the process of finishing up in Bluff, Utah, at St. Christopher's, a cultural and reconciliation center, where we will have at some point, hopefully by the end of next year, we will have 14 tiny houses. We will have 7 tiny houses done by Christmas, where we can have up to 12 people come at a time from hopefully faith communities, and be instructed by the Navajo on Navajo culture. Be able to engage with Navajo about Navajo traditions and culture, be able to go to some of the historical sites on Navajo land, but about relationship and about pilgrimage. And we hope to be able to get something out of that by spring in terms of inviting people to do that. Since I've been bishop, we've been able to develop 2 hospitality houses, where we now can have people come to all 3 regions and spend some time. And now that I have 7, actually 5 active Navajo clergy, we're now able to do more than we were able to do before. But we really are about the relationship. We really feel that we have a lot to give and to offer to the church, and we want to be able to do that. But to do that, we need to be able to tell our story and have an opportunity for you all to be able to hear that story. And so it's not, people used to come to fix us. You know, we're not in the fixing business anymore. We're into welcoming a stranger, as you all did with me. You know, come and be with us. Come and get to know us. So is that helpful?
Yeah, I just think in order for reconciliation to happen, that relationship has to happen. But then those of us who've been on the other side, we need healing too.
Exactly.
And that power differential needs to be flipped, where it's not us
Right.
coming in, setting out
Right.
more schools, right? But us sitting at the feet of Navajo clergy and learning.
And I want to be clear, and thank you for that. I want to be clear that no person in this room has caused the trauma that's taken place for our indigenous population. There's not a one of us in this room that caused that. We may have been a part of it because we're a part of who we are here in terms of the nation. But we all can be a part of the healing of that. And that's what I'm hearing you say, is that opportunity to come and learn. And so we're looking at it as an educational opportunity, not an accusatory kind of thing, but really coming to spend some time with us and hear how can we begin to come together in ways that are different. The reality is it is what it is, but how do we move out of that? So hopefully that's helpful. And would love to hear from every one of you if you're interested in coming. I'm getting ready to talk with St. Andrews and Joe and all that. And I've invited Mary to come and hang out over in Farmington. Yeah, Mary, please. Please. Yeah, thank you. That's the hope. That's the hope. And there's different ways that we can interact. What we're trying to do now is, rather than y'all just coming, you know, it used to be, if you've been out there, and some of you probably have, is that you'd call up and whoever you talk to, the priest or whoever it was at Good Shepherd or at All Saints or whatever, and say, we'd like to bring a group out. And they'd say, okay, you can come on this date. And you'd come out and there'd be no preparation. And you just show up and then you do the task and they'd thank you and you'd go home. Okay, we're not doing that anymore. If you want to be in relationship with us, then there needs to be some preparatory work that takes place in terms of relationship with us, some educational things that you can do before you can come, so that we can help you in terms of your own comfort in being able to come into a different situation. So, yeah. I got one in the back of the room, Scott. One more. I can do one more. Youth ministry has been difficult for us because of leadership. We've been able to, just recently, we were able to go over to North Dakota, South Dakota, in terms of that gathering. Part of the conflict we run into is when things are scheduled, they also impact our school-age kids, so they're not able to go, but we're balancing on that. We finally have in our budget a youth ministry, but it's taken this long to be able to get there. We have a layperson, G.J. Gordy, who has taken on the responsibility of youth ministry as it applies on a diocesan level. And so in terms of being able to go to EYE and things like that, we're able to do that and find the funding for that. But it's been a difficulty in the past with funding. We recently have gotten some grants that are allowing us to do that. And so interesting that you ask that, because that's on the agenda for our council meeting next Saturday, as to then how do we begin to work on that on a regional basis. So I'll get back to you on that one. Okay. Okay. I think I've been called. And so thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you.